thank you guys for joining me. I'm speaking with Poly Night Games and working on Innerspace. Now, before we get into all the wonderful technical stuff, can you first, you guys just introduce yourselves and the studio?
Yeah, sure.
I guess I can go first. My name is Eric Brody. I'm the producer at Poly Night Games, so I do all of the project management, and I also do all of our digital marketing. So kind of producer and head of marketing, if you will, head of the entire department of marketing of one.
Grossman, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I'm Eric Grossman. I'm a concept artist and 2D art provider, except for textures, which we haven't gotten into for Play Night Game. Yeah.
Cool. All right, and then I'm Steve. I'm one of the two 3D artists. I also do textures, so there's that. And then I build the art in the scene and the game and stuff to make it look pretty. Basically.
So, how exactly did Innerspace come to be? Like, what, just decide one day, hey, let's make this game, or has this kind of been a passion that's been brewing for a while?
Well, I think that when we first started out, we tried to be very scientific with our approach. So we knew we wanted to make games together, and we knew that all of us had different ideas for games, as everybody does, really. So I think what we did is we set out a list of criteria that we had, we need a game that can be made by this many people in this amount of time. We don't have an animator, for example, so a game that doesn't rely heavily on animation. And then we pitched all of our ideas and found the one that fit the best and kind of ran with that.
Yeah, we spent a long time during kind of the spring semester, from January through about May or so, April and May, kind of planning not only the type of games that we want to make in what eventually became Innerspace, but then also the type of company that we wanted to create, the type of studio that we wanted to make, who we wanted to work with, and the type of games that we wanted to make, and that was kind of a part of it. And because of that, the type of demographics that we knew that we were going to approach. And so we went through a long period of not necessarily pre-production, but kind of a incubation period, if you will, for our company. And then during that period, what we did is we kind of went through an exercise where we would pitch ideas to each other during that time, in which each week most of the team would pitch at least 3 games to each other, of just simply not necessarily rapid prototyping, but just simply new ideas and kind of brainstorming from there and what we could do with games. And it was from one of those pitch sessions that Innerspace was kind of born.
Okay. So it's kind of a work in progress. Yeah, thank you for the sneeze. Anything else you want to add to that too?
I think it's good.
But so it's kind of similar in a way to Double Fine's. They have their pitch where they kind of make their little prototypes and then they kind of vote on them.
Yeah, but we haven't gotten to the point where we have community voting. We mostly just hash it out.
Yeah.
Ourselves.
And essentially it was our entire community originally of the 5 of us. Our company's biggest fans were the 5 of us originally, I guess.
Well, you do fight it out, Highlander, there can only be one.
Right.
So, Innerspace, you've built it as an exploration game, and we've seen a lot of those recently, but yours is different in the fact that rather than exploring the world on literally a more grounded aspect where you're an actual character walking around, you've opted to go for an aerial approach where you can explore the world through the air and also in the sea. Why did you decide to go that kind of route as to more traditional?
Well, I can jump in on this if Steve wants to incubate his thoughts. Yeah, so I think the main idea is that a lot of exploration games take advantage of the fact that a game can transport you to a fantasy, or not fantasy, but a made-up or virtual world, and can sort of give you an experience that is sort of meaningful in that context. But what a lot of exploration games sort of don't bring along from other games is that games also can put you in another mode of movement or another mode of existence, just sort of like the character you're inhabiting. And a lot of times this also can be a source of a meaningful, like not only meaning, but like fun, or like can be kind of the essence of a game. And we felt like it would be really cool to explore how those two elements of games can work together towards a single experience. So in our case, we are tying the experience of flight to the kind of endeavor exploration. Like, it's not just like you fly to a place, get out of the plane, and walk around. Actually, the environments themselves have to be flown through to be experienced. So we're really trying to kind of bring those two together.
I think from a more Jim-Bow perspective, I don't think I've ever really seen a flying game that is also an exploration game. In fact, I think the only flying games that I've seen are either like dogfights or racing flying games. So when the idea kind of came about that, what if we put this in fun as kind of an exploration-esque way, we're kind of combining of those two genres really seemed interesting. It seemed like an interesting place to kind of creatively, play and make something. I know that also, at least for me anyway, I love exploration games. Like Metroid is like, I'm like a diehard Metroid fan. So I pull a lot of inspiration from those. And so I guess if I'm gonna make a game, right, it's probably gonna turn out to have at least some exploration elements.
Now, on your website, one of your blogs, there's a little graphic you posted where you had typical flying games, and you have your play space and content, and you have invisible boundaries, and then you have Innerspace, and you have your play space, and you're surrounded by content. Why this approach, and how exactly are you enacting this and bringing this into the game?
Well, I think that a big part of Innerspace and like what interested us in it is, and of course we're probably going to use the word exploration a lot throughout this interview.
Really?
But we knew that it created a really kind of interesting and unique play space, in an interesting, unique environment that we knew that no matter what else we did, what else we introduced into the game, that certain players were going to want to explore this on their own terms, be it if that's part of the mission structure or not. We spent a lot of time talking about games that either encouraged exploration or at least allowed exploration. So anything from like an Elder Scrolls game to even like a Grand Theft Auto game in which you can exploration isn't necessarily the main objective, but it is absolutely allowed. And we recognize that would actually be an area of opportunity for us to kind of develop, because there are going to be players who wanted to do that. And so because of that, and because of that emphasis on exploration, I think that we wanted to make sure to populate the play space at every single aspect, so that then there are plenty of ways. There's never going to be a point in which the player didn't have something that could pique their interest.
As far as actually bringing it into the game, a lot of what we're thinking about is essentially what I've been calling in our internal discussions multi-dimensional environments. So essentially you've got the skin of the sphere, and that kind of gives you your basic flying forward horizontal naturalistic experience. It most closely resembles what you'd experience flying on Earth, except that the horizon goes up. So a lot of the environments have that kind of XY design to them, which has sort of like a normal architecture. But then, of course, you can always fly up. So it's a challenge, but it's also something really cool, in my opinion, that we have to figure out how the environments can speak to, I guess it would be Z and X is the normal, and then Y is what we're adding to everything. So our environments can kind of actually all exist on a ground level, or a circumference level, and then sort of converge as they get closer, as they proceed along their radii. So thinking about environments in that way, not only on one kind of grid or another is sort of how, at least in the 2D, like figuring out how things go together side, we're trying to bring things actually into the game.
I think if I could add anything to that, it would be that the moving from the kind of like open, or I guess the closed box situation where you have a bunch of invisible walls to like a sphere, it seems very much like kind of the natural evolution of like game quote unquote should be. If you were to look at it from just or just mechanics, excuse me. And I think at least like for us as a studio and me personally, we hate invisible walls. Like it's a gaming thing, and it makes sense. Like it's understandable why it's there, but if we could find a better solution to that, I think that would be preferable. Obviously, right? So finding a way to get rid of those invisible walls by literally just putting more stuff there, making it a sphere, right? It seems like a really appealing solution to that, and kind of as a result, really creates the space that we're now building. So that was kind of an interesting approach to take, I thought. And then also, the other benefit of that is that when you think about traditional flying games, you're always kind of oriented towards the ground, right? There's always a natural plane, and then you're a natural ground plane, and then the plane itself, right? Gravity goes in one direction, and everything is oriented to that. You look up, and there's kind of nothing, right? And when you put it in a sphere and you have gravity going outward, suddenly you're not flying away from the ground and you're not oriented by the ground. Suddenly, no matter which direction you're flying, you're falling. And you're always falling towards the ground. And so, for the player at least, that kind of puts them in an interesting and different headspace. And I think that was part of the appeal of it as well.
Now, how difficult has it been to create this different environment where you are in the sphere? How different is that from people like me who are used to playing other flight games like Crimson Skies or just flight simulators where you're used to those normal planes of existence, whereas now it's more open and hey, you can go anywhere. Whereas, with Crimson Skies, it was, all right, ground, off limits. And they had very clear signposts with skyscrapers or zeppelins that you may be able to interact with, but they were still kind of off limits, like you couldn't interact with them. So how different is it to create something drastically different from all the other games that you've grown up playing, similar to this?
I'm going to think about this a little bit. If you guys want me to...
I kind of have something. Eric, do you want to say something first, though?
Well, I guess you go ahead. I do what I want to put it together.
Good question, Kim. It's not often you can stump those guys.
Success!
So I guess it kind of the way that I see it is a lot of times in game, that's kind of like where the exploration aspect comes in this game, in that what separates it from other flying games is that typically in a flying game, you have one of two types of games that you're looking at. You're looking at like a simulation flying game, something like Microsoft Flight Sim or something, in which you have a very specific objective, or again, kind of like in Crimson Skies, or another type of like kind of dogfighting flying game in which, again, you have objectives that are simply based off of a particular, like maybe more narrative-driven mission. Whereas this kind of reflects more of the open-ended nature that we're trying to kind of create for the player, in which the type of experience that, like, in the type of loops that we're creating could be used in what would otherwise be called quote unquote walking simulators, or could be done on horseback, or could be done in any other form of literal vehicles. And we happen to put in a plane, which gave it a kind of unique play style to a kind of already well-known, or at least growing style of growing element within games.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the challenges, and actually, well, like it kind of depends you're talking about, like the environment stuff, it's actually kind of liberating to kind of say, like, well, we do have these huge towers, but actually they have all these tunnels in them. So let's just like kind of open up what would otherwise be a solid impassable object and kind of make that a flight space. I'd say mechanically, the challenge isn't necessarily coming up with things, because you can kind of make anything in Unity, for example. But in my opinion, the challenge is we've got such a we're trying to present such a different world and ultimately open up a player's expectations of what they can do or like where they can go. And so the challenge is really to kind of build a bridge between what they're used to in a flight game and what they can do in our game. So we have things like the plane actually has like guns, for example, but it's not really a dogfighting game. The guns are really used as a tool. So that's one area where we're kind of bringing something that players are used to and throwing it into a new context. And the challenge there is really coming up with a progression, so to speak, even within an open-ended game, that a player will learn how to marshal their prior experiences to this new game.
That's interesting. Geez, let me think. So I think I guess from a design perspective, right, to kind of piggyback off of where Rosen was going with that, designing in this space is really just kind of a fun design challenge. I'm not even gonna say it was like particularly like arduous. It's more liberating than anything else, actually, and that's very cool and very interesting. From a technical perspective, it's been a little bit more troublesome. I know that a lot of our references are games like Shadow of the Colossus, where you have a very small character and a very large, creature or object that you interact with, right?
Right.
So with that, there's a pretty big disparity of scale, or rather, scale ranges quite a lot from the very granular to the very large. So from the, I guess, engineering perspective, on that, that's where it gets more complicated. And I think actually one of the early decisions that I made early on was to use a shading style for shaders that wasn't heavily dependent on textures. Because that saves us construction time, because we have to fill all of these bubbles with things we need to do, right? But also because textures are resolution dependent. If you get too close to it, you can see where it starts to fall apart. You can start to see the pixels, right? So using a shader that doesn't rely on those, no matter how close or far you get to an object, all of the shading on that object remains pixel perfect. And that's really cool. And then I guess from that, looking at the construction of the environments, because we have to build within such a huge range of scale, we've gone a modular route. So all of our big structures are going to be modular. So we can build really, really large things or really, really small things. All of our towns and cities and houses and things are all modular. You can assemble these in all different ways. So you can really populate the scene with a lot of stuff very, very quickly while maintaining a lot of visual variety. Yeah.
On a side note, are y'all getting any feedback from my mic, or can you just hear me when I talk?
It's really crisp. It's nice.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, fine.
Okay. All right, back to the serious business. One of your blog posts, you talked about game world cohesion, creating a narrative aesthetic. You talk about kind of you want the narrative and the aesthetic, and you want all this stuff to complement each other, and it's all going to be intertwined. And you mentioned your three-piece suit that you're calling it when you're creating the world, and you've got your mechanical, historical, and referential functions. Can you walk us through that, and what's the thought process behind using this sort of a design approach for crafting this game?
Do you guys mind if I do this?
Go for it, man. You wrote that article.
Yeah, so kind of like in the blog post, everything starts with mechanics, because at the very heart of things, we kind of believe that the game has to play well, it has to feel good. And of course, there's also an element in games where, the player supplies their own, the player's experience is half the battle as far as telling a story. So everything has to actually work in a mechanical context, especially in a flight game. So the thinking there is that you start off with, given this inverted sphere, this space, and the requirement to, have different elements in it, like terrain, structure, stuff like that. How can we craft gameplay environments with our mechanics that work, that create challenges, but also enable exploration? So that's the first part. And that's like a strict interpretation of mechanics. It's not really about perception, because we get to that later. but that's sort of the core of the game itself, and that's where we start. So it's not so much like a strict, like it's not so much like doing bounding boxes. Like the shape of this structure has to be this many units wide because the plane can fly through it. I mean, yes, that's part of it, but the main idea is that do these shapes can these shapes be marshaled or like used later to create game spaces? And like essentially in like non fancy terms, it's like, does this look fun to fly through? Which is kind of like where I started with doodling. It's like, what kind of thing would be fun to fly through and like hard to fly through? That's the beginning. But then you get to narrative function, which is essentially world building. So then you start to look at the materials that are present in the world, the construction methods, the things that sort of hint at the people that built things and the forces that shape the world, because the whole point of Innerspace is to use exploration, like interesting mechanics, to sort of tell this cumulative story, to tell a story through exploration. So the environment has to be able to tell that story. In a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, this is basically world building like you would find in like Tolkien stuff or like a lot of fantasy games, where essentially what we're saying is, okay, well, civilization clearly built this, so they had their rules and they had reasons for building things a certain way. We're not going to tell you the reasons, but the building itself is a result of all these systems. So that's why it looks the way it does. And sort of the actual design process there sort of entails kind of thinking about those rules and then designing different permutations of how those rules would manifest in different environments. And of course, connecting that to the mechanical function of how things would be. So the shape of the towers, for example, draws a lot from the fact that, well, like, this has to be fun to fly in, around, and through, but also, for whatever reason, the ancients who built this decided that they, really liked angular geometry. So those two things kind of come together. The third function, referential function, is kind of what I think is usually missing, or is usually like the most cliche part of like the world building you find in a lot of fantasy games. And essentially what referential function means for me is like, we've got this crazy world and we want it to seem original and like alien, but we also want it to be accessible on a certain level or kind of familiar.
Right.
So what a lot of fantasy games do is they'll be like, oh, well, we've got this like magical cult thing and they have a Gothic cathedral because, because Gothic, even though like their world didn't have like Romanesque and then mosques leading up to the Gothic cathedral like we did,
Right.
they just take that. So that is essentially what we're doing, but it's not quite that direct. So for example, for the design of the towers, when I was thinking of them, I was like, all right, well, I know that there's like a way, I know I've seen somewhere these like crazy concrete sculptures that like seem somehow organic, but also somehow like they're also made of concrete. So, like, where is that? And I ended up tracking down these really awesome like late Soviet sculptures and they're like spread throughout Bulgaria, and they're just like in forests now. Like they used to be these state monuments, and now they're just overgrown, and it's really cool. And the point is that even if somebody has never seen those monuments, by referencing them, it's kind of like essentially grounding our design in stuff that's possible, and therefore kind of giving it a kind of credence. So the point isn't to reference something directly, but it's basically to sort of find stuff that resonates, that like if someone gets the reference, it's resonant, but if they don't, then it still lends some grounded essence to what we're designing. And that way, like I'm not making things that are impossible, and like everything stuff kind of makes sense. And it just kind of it helps keep the design in line, but it also kind of gives the world a little bit more poeticism.
Yeah, I think one of the things that our studio does, and really any indie studio does, is designing with constraints, right? And I mean, of course, we're an indie studio, so we have to work within the bounds of what we're actually able to create. But I think that extends further into our actual design philosophy. And it's kind of one of my favorite things, actually. And the phrase I guess that I would use is designing with constraints forces you to be creative with your solutions. So that extends throughout everything that we make, including the kind of structures and things that we build, the culture that we create, and the images that are actually in game that you see as a result of that, right? So when we're talking about the towers that we're building, the civilizations that we're creating, there's a culture behind those, and as Grossman was saying, that culture informs the literal form of what you see in game, right? So we establish rules, and then we obey those rules whenever we're actually creating those structures, and that kind of philosophy applies to everything in our game, whether it's engineering the pipeline, or figuring out what kind of game we want to make, or granular all the way down to like what color should this kind of metal be, because it's going to be seen everywhere, right? So that kind of extends everywhere. And it's just kind of a zooming out portion. That's one of the more interesting elements to me.
So,
Now, you brought up those monuments, those sculptures, and something that I found interesting. I've never seen these before, and say someone like myself had no context and they just saw that picture, what would they think? And one of your captions is, you said, the monument seems like the remnants of a forgotten socialist future. So it's something interesting. You're talking about how you're creating all these things that are going to have they have their three main functions, but then you're coming in as a player and you're exploring something, and maybe your takeaway, obviously everyone's takeaway is probably going to be a little different, but you might think what the towers, their function, what they were for is completely different from what they were originally built for, too.
yeah.
So are you trying to give this sort of a very subjective, personal kind of narrative and take on the world?
Ooh, do I have to think?
Oh, I think
For $200, Steve.
Let me let you think. Okay, so
Yeah.
one of my, and a little bit of a tangent here, I promise I'm making a point. One of my favorite things is folk tales and spoken word storytelling, right? And the reason is you can have the same story being told by 3 or 4 different people, right? And every time you hear it told by a different person, it's always a little bit different, right? So on a larger scale, you see this affecting like legends and stuff over time, as one story from one culture migrated across the continents, to this other culture, right? And you see how it changes, and that's really interesting. But on a more granular level, the takeaway when each person sees and hears and gives their own interpretation is that you actually walk away with something that's more specific to you and more specific to the storyteller. Right? So that same kind of subjective mixed with thought fodder, I guess. Just here are things to think about, and you get your own individual takeaway, right? Like that, playing in that space and allowing our players to walk away with something more personal like that is vastly more interesting to me. I don't think we could construct a narrative that would be ultimately better than what you can imagine, And you see this actually applied a lot in horror games too, where the most scary thing is the thing that is least defined.
Right.
Because the more you define it, almost the more disappointing it is,
Like
It's that same
Lovecraftian,
thing.
Cthulhu mythos kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's that same idea, but applied to something entirely different. So having that subjective takeaway, letting the players, think what they want and ultimately tell their own story in that environment is really awesome. And I kind of always go back to this one, but it's our job at that point really to just make the environment as interesting to be in, and then, what you take away is what you take away.
Yeah. Steve is mostly right. I would add that there is an element of there is a specific timeline of events that happened before the game started, and so it's not just a lot of you'll see this in a lot of game jams or a lot of free games. They're really cool, but oftentimes they'll present you with this space, and there's no story. It's just whatever you take away from the space. And Innerspace kind of goes a step beyond that, where we actually do have a narrative, and there are actually in collecting physical artifacts and relics, and sort of going through that gameplay with the archaeologist, you will get more or less concrete snippets of ancient of narrative of past events.
Okay.
But there are a lot of gaps, and very big gaps, and a lot of those gaps have to be filled in by observation and exploration, which are two words that like I've typed so many times in the last 3 months. But the point is that it is a very, like Steve was saying, we want to give players a lot of thought fodder, but I mean it's not just like fodder. Like it's kind of like what I'm calling like a mosaic. Like if if you're on a dig and you find this old Roman in the real world, not in Innerspace, but like oftentimes you'll find like old Roman arcades or bathhouses or like temples, and they'll have these mosaics, right? And more often than not, the mosaic will be missing like half the pieces, but you'll still be able to kind of piece together what you think the image is. Maybe it's what are they called? The constellations, the horoscope. What are they called? The signs. I don't remember what they're called.
Zodiac?
Yes, thank you. Zodiac. Yeah, right. Brain fart. Yeah, it's usually like a zodiac or like a legend or something, and you get hints. So that's kind of my approach to the narrative in Innerspace, or like how I think about it, is that it's essentially a mosaic or like a cumulative story where you're kind of collecting fragments and you have to fill in the rest yourself. And the environments really are designed to deliberately allow for a range of interpretations. Like, is that a fortress? Is it a temple? Is it a city? Like, what am I looking at? And kind of from the context, we hope players get their own ideas and kind of want to push that further. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that, so kind of hit on that point. When we break it down mechanically for the player, there are really like two things that they're actively doing whenever they're playing the game, right? And the first one is the very literal, like, finding of things, right? So you're exploring space and you're observing, you're taking things in, but you're actually, like, pursuing things. You're trying to find these relics. You're trying to find the things that we've hidden in the environment, so to speak, right? So while this is happening, you're observing and you're taking things in, but the ultimate function is a very literal and a very physical one, right? The second half of that, though, and this is a more interesting element for, I think, on the narrative side anyway, is that there's a mental process happening here. So you've found relics, you've observed, and you've learned or at least imagined what they can mean based on what they look like. You're in the space, you're gathering information. You're always gathering information, right? So while you're literally and physically doing things, mentally you're also assembling the narrative, right? And that is very much a player action. So we're trying to get the player as engaged as possible. And the two things that we're letting the player actively do while they're in the space are literally moving within it, and then mentally keeping them entertained and active. And that's kind of the breakdown of the player interaction with that, I guess.
So, forgive me if I'm wrong. In a very simple way, the amount that the player gets is really up to them, but you have enough there that if a player wants to explore, say I really want to know what's going on, I can explore fully, but no matter how much, there's always going to be a little bit there that you don't explicitly state, but there's enough referential material where you can draw the gaps and connect the dots, so to speak. Kind of similar to how Dark Souls, they dump you in a world with a little bit of background, but if you really want to go and dive into it, which some people have, and produce some ridiculously crazy, oh wow, the things that connect, but to those people that just want to go kill things and die, then they can go do that.
Yeah, Tyler, our programmer and creative director, is a diehard Dark Souls fan, and I'm personally kind of too much of a wimp to jump in and play it. Also, I don't have 200 hours of free time, but I really admire the game. So yeah, I think like that thinking has seeped into Innerspace.
Well, and I think that not to kind of like Steve, I'll start somewhere and then I'll get back to the point of Innerspace. Is I'm a writer and I'm really interested in criticism, like what I think you and I kind of talked about a little bit in emails, and something that in his treatise on new games journalism that Kieran Gillen had talked about like 10 years ago, in which he was kind of arguing like how games should be reviewed, is he kind of pointed out that games are an experience, and that what you should actually look to is not necessarily other art critics, but that for criticism for games, you should actually look towards travel journalists, because the way that they actually approach their work is pretty similar to how a video game writer should actually approach his, in that what you're doing is you're actually portraying and relating your experiences and your personal experiences of this travel, of this journey to the reader. And every single one of those journeys is unique in and of itself. Two people can go visit like Mayan temples and have entirely different perspectives on the journey, for just simply because they're bringing their own personal bias into play, and some of the things that you were talking about in their own personal level of understanding of that civilization's history and their level of interest to learn that civilization's history. And I think that what's really cool about what we're doing is we're actually kind of building on that idea, exactly like what Steve was kind of talking about, where at any given time when you play a game, there are two narratives that are happening simultaneously. You have the narrative that's taking place that is actually on the screen, that the writers wrote and that the game designers designed, and the game's plot. And then you also have the player's narrative of actually playing, the activity of actually playing the game, often called like Ludo narrative. And that kind of, sometimes of course you can have a separation between the two. But what I think is really cool is that intersection where those 2 points meet. And I think that's something that we're really trying to play around with this particular game, in that we're putting you into the position of an explorer. And we're putting you into this really weird alien world, which is both different to you and different to the protagonist. And what the player wants to do with that is really kind of up to him or her. And I think that really kind of reflects not only how we want the narrative to be taken in, whether or not somebody actually wants to experience deeper or not, but then we also are kind of analyzing, if you will, or simply dissecting the experience of playing a game, because there will be plenty of players who don't necessarily care to learn those things in the same way that most people, some people might not care about a specific trip to an art museum or to a Mayan civilization or something like that. So.
Oh, very eloquent. Nice job, dude.
Thank you.
Yeah, I gotta read that article. That's, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's one of the most influential pieces I've ever written or read. When it comes to like Minecraft, it's great.
Yeah, well, I mean, looking at rock paper shotguns, like a lot of their really good features. Sorry to digress, but like you can really see the impact of that ideology. It's cool.
Yeah,
very, very much so. Now, I had a thought. Something that you brought up is you're actually playing as the cartographer in Innerspace. You're playing as someone who's mapping these unknown worlds. And that's really going hand in hand with the player, because as a player, we're dumped in this place that we don't know anything about, and we're exploring these worlds not only as a cartographer, but as a player, but we're also doing that dual role where we are the cartographer. As we explore, we're making our own maps, and we are piecing together our story, and like you said, we're developing our own personal narrative of what happened. So why did you decide to go for that approach, to make the cartographer the player exploring this world, whereas just some other approach?
Well, I know Eric has some things, but can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. Well, a lot of times what'll happen, or I know that I personally have a really hard time with Japanese RPGs, because so many times they'll dump you into like in media res, and like all these characters already have had like 20 years of history with each other, and there's like a really dramatic scene, but I don't really understand why it's dramatic, and I don't really care why I have to go from this place to another, simply because of the dichotomy between the experience that I've had as a player and the experience that my characters have had with one another. There's not a great meaningful connection there, and that connection has to be bridged by like 14 hours of exposition and like cutscenes. And not only do we not have the budget for 14 hours of cutscenes, though we have a good friend, we also don't really think it's the most conducive way to tell a game story, because as Eric was saying, a game is really a player experience, and it really lives on that. And essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to allow the player to inhabit their role within the game without having to be told why they're doing it. We wanted the player's own motivations to be able to kind of thrive and to carry them through the experience.
Okay.
And the best way to do this is to kind of align the protagonist's goals with theirs. And the other thing is when you're playing like Grand Theft Auto or something, oftentimes there's like the story which like the character cares about, and then there's like the game which you care about. And very rarely do they actually intersect.
Running over people, yeah.
Right, like getting the rocket launcher, how long you can survive, which Eric did in his youth. Like there's there's so much stuff that people love about those games, putting it on your map and telling you like,
I think Eric, you're cutting out a little bit, dude.
Yeah.
like, oh, you should really go. Oh, I am. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Just do the whole thing again.
Oh yeah, okay. So like in Grand Theft Auto, even though there's that divergence, the game itself really wants you to play the story. Like they spent lots of money on it, and so they keep putting icons on your map. Like you should really go do the thing with the gang so you can get to the next island. Like come on, like you really should. But and you can kind of choose if you want to, but it kind of makes for like a weird kind of fragmented experience. And we wanted the game itself to encourage its own gameplay and sort of like be its own kind of life form. So essentially, short answer is we didn't want to push anything on the player, and the best way to do that was to give the protagonist a role that reflects what the player is going to be doing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's a very eloquent way to put it. The only thing that I would kind of add to it, is something that I think that to provide an example of another game that did it really well. I think that Last of Us did a really great job with that. One of my favorite things about that game is how well the narrative actually meshes in with the gameplay, and by that, what I actually mean is as you progress through the story, you get better weapons, or at least the materials to create better weapons, and eventually get better tools. And early on in the game, you feel rather helpless when both against humans and against the I don't remember what they're called. Are they infected? Yeah. And what's interesting about it is early on in the game, not only do you feel, does it really do a very good job at making sure that you actually feel helpless in this situation, but it does a really good job at kind of portraying Joel's feeling for that as well. And as you progress through the story and Joel gets farther and farther away from his home city, and he becomes more confident as a character within this universe that you are learning about as he is learning about, you as a player are growing much more confident as well. And it happens really organically and happens really well. And that's something that not necessarily that we're trying to create a parallel between us and Last of Us, but that is an example of a game that did it extremely successfully, where the player and the character, who is not necessarily in that situation, an avatar character, actually grow simultaneously together through the process of gameplay.
Nothing to add, Steve?
A few things, but no, I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, though. Rather than thrusting a role onto a player like you mentioned with RPGs, especially the JRPGs, you establish kind of a role and let the player kind of make their own, and they already have the encouragement through the role. And like you said with Joel's supposed to be transporting this girl, so as he goes and he explores, so does the player, and you both get more stronger and confident. That's a good example, and it's an interesting way to think about the game.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something that you've mentioned a lot and something that was in several of your blog posts is the mechanics of the flight. You want to make the flight feel good. And also the whole world's going to be different, so some of it's going to be... But you're trying to make the base mechanics good, and like you mentioned here, Telltale games, they have great narratives, but really the mechanics underlying the whole thing are not that great, because if you take the trappings away from it, and you just had the game as itself without the narrative trappings, it'd be kind of a dud to play. And that could go for a lot of adventure games, but you specifically, I kind of agree, because without the narrative, it would be really frustrating and kind of difficult and really just boring. So, how did you decide to try to make this mindset where you want to have good mechanics and want to have the game to be fun, but also it kind of ties into what else you're trying to do with the game? If that makes sense.
I feel like I need a little bit more.
Did I stump you again?
Sorry.
And let me see. I think Tyler wrote this article. Yeah, he mentioned something here actually, that Spec Ops: The Line is one of my favorite games as far as narratives and doing things through mechanics and just overthrowing the player's expectations. And he said some games have thrived on doing very little new in this domain. And he mentioned Spec Ops, and I found that interesting because I think Spec Ops is one of the more interesting and daring games as far as what it did in the last generation.
Yeah.
I will say that I have I just bought it and I'm just working through it right now, so I don't catch that.
Yeah, that was I played through the demo. That was one that was always on my short list of things that I knew I needed to play, because of all of the wonderful criticism that was coming from it, regarding how narrative in a military game should be handled. But I've yet to experience that myself, unfortunately.
What I have to say about Spec Ops is, I haven't finished it, but what I have to say about Spec Ops is, from what I've experienced, the really interesting thing about it is that the actual mechanics are really familiar to anybody who's ever played a military shooter, and that's on purpose, because it is a game that is breaking down, that is telling its story from within the genre.
Right.
It's like Apocalypse Now in so many ways, but also in that it's a war movie / war game that has the spectacle of war, like contrasted with the horror of war. Like it uses the language of war entertainment to criticize war entertainment, and that's kind of how it do, as far as I understand it, which is really cool. And really interesting. I think for Innerspace, the idea is to kind of, it's not quite so incendiary or critical overtly anyway, but I'd say the decision to do that was essentially that, again, it kind of goes back to the player, where we kind of understand games as basically living on player interest and kind of what the player wants to do. And so the original idea was basically that a lot of times you'll see really interesting exploration games that will, like, they basically only appeal to a certain kind of person who doesn't really mind not really having a gameplay challenge. They mostly just want to experience the world, and in that sense they become kind of they all have like a similar tone to, like Dear Esther and Proteus are both kind of like meditative, relaxing games. Right. And so you have to be a certain kind of person or be in a certain kind of mood to really get a lot out of them. And I think where I'm going with this is that by approaching it from the perspective of, we want it to have really slick gameplay mechanics, is that it actually becomes something that you're playing, and it becomes more of an experience that comes to you in a way. Like, I feel like in a lot of ways, Proteus and Dear Esther are kind of like games that you have to decide that you want to play, or like the Stanley Parable. It's like, oh, like, I want to go play those games to experience that specific cultural item. Whereas, like, with a game with mechanics, it's like, I kind of want to. You can approach from a lot of different angles. Like, you can say, like, I want to explore, or you can say, like, I just want to play and have fun, or fly around and do lots of things. But they all kind of converge on this single experience. And so I guess the commercial way of putting it would be, we don't really think about this in the design stage, but like one way of thinking about it is that we want to appeal to a broader range of players and allow people to bring what they want to the game. So the flight, it's not like Ikaruga or like a bullet hell. Like, like you don't have to have a specific skill set to succeed in Innerspace necessarily. Like
Thank God.
there's a there's a learning curve, and there will be challenges. Like it's not just a free for all. But on the other hand, it's not it's not a game that you have to stress out about learning the intricacies of necessarily to get anywhere. So I think the idea was to build a game that has a lot of pathways towards the same experience.
Yeah, I think oh. Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that familiar is a good word there, and something that to kind of build off of your point that I know we've talked about before, and I think I might have brought up in an interview at one point in time as well, is that there's kind of two answers to this. There's kind of there's an easy answer in which something that we're trying to encourage is for people to kind of relax and observe the scenery. And if it was difficult to maneuver the plane, and we had a lot of kind of realistic physics in the game, then that would be very difficult to try to deliver upon. The kind of deeper level that like Eric was starting to kind of talk about is that, like, I mean, if you were to separate this from other flying games, and that it does feel like it does feel like flying games with
Oh,
I think he's gone.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I hope you realized.
I don't know if he knows. I'm gonna shoot him a text real quick. Oh my goodness, I just 20 messages. Alright, well, I'm not gonna read those.
He's still talking to himself.
Is he?
Oh, I don't know.
Hey,
Just imagine him sitting there going on this long spiel and come back. Oh, we didn't catch any of that.
that would be really unfortunate. Okay. Okay, so while he's gone, at least, let me see if I can contribute anything else to this point. I think when you think about games in a larger sense, to really kind of zoom things out again, as I tend to do, games are closed experiences, they're closed loops, right? And the player has a place within that structure, right? So when you think about a game as an entity, it's a closed thing. You know, it's designed to do something. It's designed to interact with the player and vice versa, have someone interact with it, right? And it works because of that. But when you have a closed structure like that, then you have an external entity, the player, acting on it, right? That's an interesting and kind of strange structure, right? So, oh, hey, he's back.
Hey.
Hey, man.
Hey. Okay, cool. Sorry about that.
I'm making a point where you're gone. Let me
Go for it.
So that's a really interesting structure. And so I think a lot of this conversation we've been having has kind of been revolving around how the player as an external fits in and interacts with this closed system. And so the kind of minimalist exploration approach that we're taking, the player character narrative alignments that we're trying to do, the kind of lowering the barriers to entry and allowing the players to kind of play the game at their own pace as they will with their own experience and kind of with their own intention in mind. All of this kind of harkens back to that same understanding of the player and the game and how those two pieces connect, right? And so in a certain perspective and light, I guess, the whole thing is kind of designed as almost a metaphor, I guess, for the way these two very separate things interact with each other and what that means. I'm also an artist.
Now, Eric, how long were you talking before you realized that you dropped out?
Oh no, pretty immediately.
Okay.
Yeah. And so honestly, Steve kind of started where I stopped. That was largely the point that I was starting to make was that we're just lowering that barrier to entry is incredibly important for, I think, what we're trying to portray. And yeah, I was just giving a few examples, but he explained it pretty well.
Now, have any of y'all played the recent game, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter?
I have it on my wish list, but I haven't played it.
No, yeah, I want to.
Well, it's interesting because it uses the walking simulator, quote unquote, genre, where you're exploring this world, but they have a very set narrative because you're piecing together this mystery of what's happened to this place, why are there corpses everywhere, what's going on. But so they have this typically this is very open sort of exploration type of game with very multiple, like a multiple narrative, personal thing. But they have a very concrete story that they're telling, but then they have an ambiguous ending. I was just wondering if y'all had played that in any way. Now, we talked a lot about abstract stuff. How about some stuff that's maybe more concrete? Maybe I won't stump you as much.
Sure.
You have a very interesting and it's a very striking aesthetic that you've gone for. Someone's excited.
I think it's both
And like you mentioned on the blog, it's an art style that unifies gameplay and narrative, and it lends depth to the game's universe while giving meaning to exploration. Can you go into a bit more detail and tell us about how you've kind of created that and what separates this from other games of this type?
So do you have something on that, or do you want to think?
That was supposed to be easier.
So,
Yeah, okay.
Can you expand on my question just a little bit?
Yeah.
All right. So in your blog, Eric, you wrote you want the players to want to spend their time with the game, and you want to tell a story without breaking away from the gameplay. You don't want it to be two divergent things. You want the players to always come back to it.
Right.
And you decided, all right, the solution, an art style that unifies your gameplay with your narrative. And through this art style, you're also giving background and depth into the universe while the player's exploring, but also giving meaning into the exploration of it. And it's similar to how you said your three-piece suit where everything has those three functions, but what specifically about this aesthetic, like what are the stylings of it that make it very appealing and that the player wants to keep coming back to?
I see. Okay.
I can't talk and let you bail you guys out. You're gonna have to answer this one.
Okay.
PR guy can't save us now.
All right. The basic construction element that I personally love, like constantly putting let me back up. I guess it kind of comes down to the different dynamics of how the elements interact. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the idea of the mechanical function really comes down to, is this fun to fly through? And that kind of informs a lot of the initial design decisions. So, for example, the terrain, we really don't have a lot of solid land masses, right? We have a lot of arches and islands and things like jutting out of the water and like branching over. And if you've got like your circumference, there will be like an island or like two islands kind of conjoined and with like stuff. So it's really those elements. It's that kind of thinking that leads to a lot of other things, like the structures themselves, the towers. They are all built with basically a two-part system. At least on the exterior, it's the lighter color material, like these blocks, these kind of like this plating, which is sort of fastened to a stronger, sturdier like core material. And as Steve was saying, this is intended to be a modular system, which we're still essentially developing and optimizing. But what this does is it creates an interplay of like vast surfaces with a lot of crannies mixed with beams that kind of go horizontally and vertically and have their own gaps. And it's kind of like that form kind of comes from the culture that built it, but then it leads to interesting gameplay environments because those towers they act in two ways. They act as an exterior gameplay environment, like say you're flying in the overworld from point A to B. You might have to navigate through a series of towers with like interconnected bridges and like pillars and stuff. But then there are larger structures that use those same rules built by the same people that have interior spaces that are also essentially made from those materials with probably like other puzzly stuff that we can't get into yet. But the idea is that those building elements, that interplay continues on kind of different levels. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's a second civilization that is kind of built on top of the original towers, and they've got like this beam and like cable sort of construction, and they actually hang sort of like ceremonial gardens from the horizontal bridges and beams of the ancients. So they're living on top of the older culture, and they're also dead though, and that's very sad. But the point is that these two different structures create another dynamic on that level, where you can fly, between cables. We're hoping eventually we get the programming down so that you can cut the cables and like cause gardens to fall, which is an environmental interaction. As you can see in the video, when you reach the surface of the towers, the like sort of bracing and beams that hold the new civilization can be flown up through and sort of create miniature courses that require a lot of tight flight control. And so I guess what I would say is the art style, like following the rules of like the 3-piece suit, leads us to think about, like, kind of leads to a lot of interesting surface dynamics that exist on multiple levels that we're already kind of seeing in the early stages of building the game. You want to add anything, Steve?
Yeah. So I guess on the note of wanting to come back to the game, wanting to play the game, and like just the initial like desire to experience it, right? I think first and foremost, the player has to want to, right? And when you think about art in general, right? Like, how do we like looking at art? We like looking at pretty things, right? It's a really strong note there. If something is visually compelling already, there are points in that course, no matter what the actual content is, right? So right off the bat, I think personally, as well as kind of all of us in the studio, wanted to make something very pretty. And I think we've done that. I'm extremely proud of the work that we've created. But yeah, right off the bat, like we wanted to make something pretty, and as a result of it being attractive, visually appealing, already it's more compelling, right off the top. Secondly, though, and kind of back to the notion of creating based on constraints. One of the coolest things about the space that you're in is the way gravity affects it, right? So we have these large towers, and like if you think about the sphere, you've got all of your objects that are kind of aligned along the outward edge of that sphere, right? And that's kind of the basics of it. When you think more in depth about the way kind of gravity functions in this space, you can start to imagine objects that span the gap from side to side in the sphere, right? And the question then becomes, how does gravity actually affect that, right? You have structures on the surface, or on this object that spans the entire length of this sphere, right? Gravity is going to affect those structures differently depending on where they are on this big beam, right? So you'll have structures that are huge, and you'll see objects on them, and this object will be on the top. And if you look down the path a little bit longer, you'll see the objects that are on it now are kind of on the bottom of this thing, and it's an interesting thing to see and observe, and it's an interesting space to be in, right? And so this kind of like strange structural, rule set that we can follow is kind of pervasive in everything. One of my favorite moments, actually, when just kind of playing and testing our game, was flying through and shooting breakable walls, right? So there was a section where I had, gone upside down and, done loops and things, and was flying through this little tunnel that we created. And I shot the destructible wall in front of me to break through it. But instead of the pieces falling, they fell sideways. And just kind of in and of itself, that was a really interesting experience because it wasn't expected. And it is kind of in a nutshell the experience of being in this space, right? So having something that's visually appealing, and then having rules and stuff that allow us to make really interesting architectural decisions, really interesting choices about like what we're actually making. Kind of marrying those two together is, I think, my favorite thing about our art style, and one of the most compelling things visually about Innerspace.
I agree. It's very pretty. It's very striking, and I definitely cannot
Agreed.
wait to get my hands on it and just see more about it. So I would say, yeah, kudos, hats off to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you've mentioned a lot about your influences, some of your inspirations, maybe, or just influences, Dear Esther, Proteus. But another one you mentioned was Shadow of the Colossus, which anyone who played that know you fight gigantic, towering, visually interesting colossi. And in your game, in Innerspace, you're supposed to meet these demigods of sorts. Can you tell us a little bit about them and how the player will interact, and also maybe about, if you can at this point, tell us maybe some inspirations behind their designs, if that's not super spoily?
I think a little bit of that we do have to kind of guard. We're still very much in development on that one.
Okay.
And still a lot of big decisions that we have to make. That being said, we can certainly talk about it. But just be aware, I guess. Like we haven't yet found all of our, we haven't yet decided on a lot of things. So it's still kind of up in the air.
That's fine.
I can kind of give you a little bit of insight into the lines that I've thought along, and like it doesn't reveal anything more than what I've already put in the blog post, Eric. So is that okay? Can I?
Yeah, you're fine. Little sneak preview for Caleb.
Yeah. So I'll address both parts briefly. So the first part, how you meet them, how you interact with them. We really want the encounter with them to be a really sort of amazing. I don't know, amazing. Like, I mean, yes, amazing, but I wouldn't use that word. Like, really cool experience. So I don't want to give that away. As far as how we're designing the encounters, we are thinking we're taking the idea of small player, big thing from Shadow of the Colossus, but what we're leaving behind is the necessity that you kill them, at least in our preliminary thinking. So it might change, but at the moment we're thinking that, destroying this thing, essentially these demigods are creatures that are linked in some way to their world and to the continued life of their sphere, right? So in that context, it's not a given that killing ending that life is going to solve the problem that you're trying to solve by meeting them. So keep an eye out for really interesting encounters in that sense. As far as inspirations for the design, it kind of zooms out, but sort of the thematics of the designs are based on the idea of balance. So, for example, the world that the sort of crab-like crustacean, the mountain lives in is a lush garden world that has overgrown primeval foliage, like huge vines that are wrecking all the towers and islands and stuff. It's crazy. And so the other world has to sort of balance that out. And the crab god is sort of a life giver and like a life bringer. So the other world, we're thinking, has to balance that out in some way. So we're thinking of a lot of different ways that can manifest, and we're taking inspiration from, nature and folklore and legends, and kind of seeing how we can wrap it into our own interpretation and our own creation. But those are sort of the lines we're designing the gods across. The gods are fun because we're allowed to get a little bit more cosmic and a little bit more out there. We've been really down in the trenches with the civilizations, thinking about did they have electricity? What material did they use? But now it's kind of fun to kind of zoom out and be how does this thing interact with the cosmic energies of this universe? So that's fun. But we'll kind of update everyone as we develop that more.
I was going to say, actually, just a little plug here. I'm actually working on making one of them right now, the craft, the mountain one. So it's you can find that on Twitch. I can upload an images if you want. It's very much work in progress, but we're actively doing that.
Okay. Very interesting. It's always cool in games when you have that massive sense of scale. So it's definitely something that, from what I've seen, I'm looking forward to the game. Obviously, I'm a little bit excited, so I'm a little biased towards this stuff.
Yeah, that's okay. We're okay with that.
Yeah, it's no problem for me.
Are you sure?
Absolutely.
No.
Actually, I will say, okay, I would love to do an interview. Like, I would love to sit down with somebody who just hates our game. And
Like, shut up, stop talking, stop. Ah.
Just because I want to see their perspective. Yeah?
Yeah, but I love that we're sitting down with somebody who's excited for our game first. I'm just saying.
Right.
Yeah.
I just imagine they'd be like Ben Stein, just, this sounds great.
Yeah.
But, so, another interesting thing that caught my eye is it's not only aerial flying game, but you mentioned how the plane transforms to become a submarine of sorts. So when you hit the ground, there isn't a failure state. You encourage the player to continuously explore and to just to see what all is out there instead of just saying, no, you can't go there, like the invisible walls that you mentioned. So how did that process kind of come to be? How many James Bond movies did you watch to come up with this concept?
I don't really have a lot to say on this one. Let me just jump in with one thing before we do it. That's cool.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So on the notion of exploration and hitting things, one of the bigger and more risky, I guess, design decisions that we've made was to make it so that when you hit things with the plane, it bounces off instead of like throwing it. Now, obviously, like if you hit something head on, you're gonna blow up and die, right? But because our game is exploration based, and because we're using an airplane to do that, right? We're marrying mechanics that don't necessarily match each other. And so we have a few ways to get around that. One of them we've already kind of detailed in our Kickstarter video, which is this stalling functionality that you can very easily control the plane and have a lot of very tight and very specific control over your flight path. But the other one is actually just straight up not punishing the player for exploring. We want them to go into places that are hard to reach. We want them to do these, interesting maneuvers and go to that tight spot that's way out in the middle of nowhere because there's something over there that looks interesting, right? And if they get damaged or blow up or whatever kind of along the way, that would not encourage them to do that, So that extends to the whole environment, and going underwater on a mechanical side offered us a really interesting and convenient solution to one of our biggest design choices, which is you've got the air to explore, you've got the ground bits to explore, but what else can we do to make this gameplay more interesting? And dropping into the water, we're able to preserve, with modifications, a lot of our flight mechanics. Underwater submarine controls are very similar to airplane controls, right? So in that sense, we don't have to make a whole lot of new things, but we can still create a very interesting and very new experience for the player, right? So it was an efficiency decision from a mechanics perspective.
Go ahead. Sorry.
That's pretty much it, really. Just efficiency, and then I guess just allowing more interesting things for the player to do without saying, no, you can't go there. Like an Assassin's Creed fight. Like the first one, you drop in the water and you drown. I'm like, why? That kind of thing. It's fighting this kind of like game logic when there's something more that could be fun there. Why not just do that?
We all know assassins can't swim, so surround your castle and house with a moat.
I didn't think about that.
The knowledges. God help you. One thing I would add is that what's kind of nice, what I noticed, like just when I was playing some of like the earliest iterations, like especially the Kickstarter kind of like build we had for filming that video, was that even though the actual mechanics of diving are analogous to flying, there's a critical moment of skill in diving. So you it doesn't automatically happen. You do have to actually like manually change the. I mean, you don't have to manually like fold it, but like it's a button. It's a button press. So you do actually have to decide to go into that mode, and it creates a really interesting kind of gameplay rhythm because you can dive, and then when you want to come back up, there's a critical moment where you have to press that button. Otherwise, you will simply dive back down. And if you time it wrong, if you time it wrong in the earliest build we didn't have a solution yet, you die. But there's just like an interesting moment there that I think kind of crystallizes. The other thing I just kind of want to add is like from a world building, like thematic perspective, having we could make a dry world with like air and ground with like flying, and we could technically still have a flying exploration game, but adding water, it's kind of like with painting, like you add more colors to express your idea better. So like water can be, we have a lot of thematic stuff going on in this game, and so like water can be destructive or restorative and alters the environment in a lot of interesting ways, and kind of gives like a natural systems presence. So like we have weathered rocks and stuff, and you see like weathered terrain, and you see the water below it, you're like, oh, like I get it, like that terrain was worn down by water, and like maybe the water used to be higher, so something changed in the world. So water is really useful as a visual signaling system, and as like a thematic instrument, and being able to dive into it just sort of expands our storytelling abilities.
Okay. I like the idea how the player has to consciously decide, all right, I want to go see what's down there, or say, I want to go explore the sky some more. That's an interesting mechanic. You're not forcing them to do it. Once again, it's up to the player.
Yeah, and I think that kind of to build on that, a lot of kind of the design process, or at least I know our design process, isn't really necessarily from like, hey, here's a cool thing, let's figure out how to do it. Instead, it's and this is actually something that I will absolutely give credit to, something I've learned from Steve in the time that I've worked with him, is to try to approach a game from a very core theme, and just simply and then build everything based on whatever that theme is. And so originally, kind of like what Eric was talking about just now, originally the pitch was this was originally Tyler's pitch back in the spring, and it was, what could we do to make flying more interesting, or at least how could we do it differently? Something that again that Steve says, like during the brainstorming process, is when somebody throws out an idea, he'll say, hey, I like that feels too easy. How can we challenge ourselves a little bit more? How can we maybe improve upon that? Look at the areas of opportunity within whatever that idea is to improve upon it, not only with us as designers, but then within the medium of games themselves. And so originally the original idea was kind of actually what Eric talked about, was Caleb, you and I were talking, you actually watch anime, was essentially, what if we made Gurren Lagann the game? And because interesting space. So like, what if there was this underworld, like this underground space in which you're surrounded by rock, and you could dig into that world, but then when you dug out of that world, then you could actually like fly around. And that's cool, and that's interesting. And then we integrated water into it, because there were because then we added some of the thematic elements that Eric kind of talked about. Because then you get kind of the cool dichotomy between two of the major elements, and then all the thematic elements that Eric was talking about. And then beyond that, then it kind of the ideas just evolve in the design process, or at least they do for us. And so then the part that really, I know, intrigued me with this idea, and part of the reason I was really interested in trying to pursue it, was then with those thematic elements, and with the idea of how unique that is, to be able to control the plane in such a way that you can't fly, that you can't go underwater, is then when we introduce big creatures. I have a big literature background, and so the very first thing that I thought of was, could we come up with some type of theme that was an allusion to, or at least a reference of, something like Moby Dick. And like what we were talking about with the demigods, is it's not necessarily a just action story. It's not necessarily a go out and a big hunter, go out and kill the things. We're trying to explore kind of the relationship between man and nature, possibly man and gods, and something that, and not to get too deep into anything else, but like stories that have done that well. I always really like stories that don't necessarily take a side one way or the other, and try to reflect both ideals, and try to make both sides sympathetic. Princess Mononoke did a really good job of this. Hayao Miyazaki has always done a good job with this, like with Nausicaa, Princess Mononoke, and some of his other works, in which absolutely sometimes the antagonists are entirely evil, and yet they come from a sympathetic standpoint in which they are trying to protect themselves. And so that's kind of how we got to where we did with the water, and they were kind of, and so again, it's that evolution of ideas that is kind of how we got to where we did, and we were kind of able to do cool stuff with it, and that's how we ended up with it.
I really want to go and log on games, so after Innerspace, you should just make that. You've got my imagination going wild now. Thank you so much.
It would be terribly hard. All you do is take the water that we have and instead change it so that it's brown, and then put a big blue on the front of the plane. There you go. Good log on.
I just want the archaeologist to say aim to the heavens at some point.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
But then you have to have someone that you can kill off rather easily too. Be like, all right, all these people die. Now, as far as the development process, you're in the middle of a Kickstarter right now. Where exactly in the development process are you, would you say? Or can you say? Dun, 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 dun.
We can absolutely say. So right now, what we created for the Kickstarter was a fully functioning play space, a fully functioning demo. Now, when I say demo, I don't mean something that we can release and have anybody play. Everything that we've shown is either concept art, which is not game at all, or is directly in-game, running in real time. So we're not doing any kind of like cutscenes, we're not doctoring anything up, it's just the game itself. And that was really kind of a learning tool. Our general business model is that we come together, we do a bunch of pitches, we figure out which one we think would be the best game to approach for the next however long cycle we would want to develop it for, right? And then we spend 3 months building that, right? So we have internal validation that says, okay, this seems like our best option right now, and is also something that we want to build, both from like a, let's be an actual business and also from a artistic integrity side. And then we spend 3 months making that, so we're not down a whole lot of time. And then we bring it to Kickstarter. And at Kickstarter, we say, okay, here's the thing, here's the proof of concept, it functions, it works, we like this, and we ask for external validation, essentially. So if we get, Kickstarter, if enough people support us, enough people back us, right? That says that, okay, there's enough demand for this game to justify actually making it beyond just us saying we want to make it, right? So that's when our actual, full-on development process goes. And in that process, we take what we built, we take all the things that we learned from it, and then we adjust and apply those to the larger scale. And we build off of the small thing that we started with, right? So that's what we've developed in Innerspace so far, and that's kind of the junction that we're at right now. We're seeing if there's enough support and enough interest in our idea, and then depending on how that goes, we either break it down, deconstruct it, learn from it, and then build it back up even better, or we go back to the drawing board and do something different.
I should also point out, though, that we're not just, Steve's right, but I should point out that we're not just kind of like hanging out waiting to see what happens with Innerspace. Right now, Tyler's doing a lot of work on optimizing the back end and actually preparing to be built. Steve, of course, is sculpting the first demigod, and we're getting, we're making stuff for the actual game, and of course, I'm over here designing more stuff as well. So we've still got all the cogs running, but as far as the development process, yeah, Steve's right. We're in kind of a we're kind of cautiously evaluating how much demand there really is for our game.
Yeah, and I actually didn't mean to imply that we're not doing work, because Jesus Christ. Oh my God. No. Yeah, man, we're still definitely developing. Our job doesn't end as soon as we hit Kickstarter. I think it's actually where it gets the most difficult. For a couple different things, right? On one hand, marketing really kicks up, and that's Eric Brady's thing. But we all have to participate in that. We all have to really spend time doing that. And the other part of that is continued development, right? So we don't stop just because we're Kickstarter. And like Grossman said, we're actually developing, we're in active development. But it's this kind of midpoint where we can kind of take a little bit of a step back and really analyze what we've made and how we progress going forward.
Yeah, and I think that another really good point to try to really at least clarify is while this validation process of Kickstarter is definitely a part of the process, and that if successful, then we know that it's something, again, as Steve said, the marketplace does want, or at least a small part of the marketplace does want. And if it's not successful, then it doesn't necessarily mean that we're entirely scrapping the game. Innerspace is absolutely something that we've built a few games together already. We feel that we kind of know what we're doing when it comes to the process, and it's an idea that we believe would make for a solid final deliverable. But what it would do if we say did fail is it would, when you said going back to the drawing board, it would mean they would allow us to dissect what was positive, what was negative. We've gotten a lot of good comments from people on what they like. Luckily, not a whole lot of comments of what people don't like. But again, it allows us to really assess the game and what could be done better going forward with it.
All right. Now, provided and fingers crossed, hopefully, that you'll meet your Kickstarter goals, maybe even exceed it. If that goes well, what kind of a timeline? Do you have a timeline, or is it just, hey, when this is done, this is done? Are you gonna tease us with a date?
Yeah, that would be really nice, is to be able to approach it from that perspective. And maybe if we already had a game that we had launched that then is already bringing in money, then we could kind of approach it a little bit that way. But of course, part of the difficulty of the development process that we're in right now, and then of course when you add on the Kickstarter process on top of it, is most of us are still current students, and we'll each be graduating at some point within the next year, or at least leaving school at some point in the next year, and that will help. But then that almost makes things even more difficult, because then we need to start making money, and so the longer that we push back development, or at least push back the publish date, the longer it is before we have any money in our coffers and money in our pockets to live, and to get away from, like, say, our part-time jobs, so that we can actually focus on just game development as a whole. That being said, whenever we won't publish a game that is not ready, and so it's especially, I think that's important to say within the light of the past week of game releases that we've seen, and all the articles that have been written about that subject. I think that right now what we are pushing for is like a year to year and a half product cycle, year and a half from essentially when we started. And so we are definitely shooting for a 2015 release date. Right now, let's say fall, early winter.
Okay. I think that's getting to the part where I think I've asked most of the pertinent questions that I want to, and I've rambled enough. This is normally the part where if you have any specific comments that you want to throw out for our readers, or if you want to ask a question to me or anything like that, have at it.
So before we move on to a different topic then, while this topic is still kind of fresh, let me just throw something out there. Because of the place that we're at, both as indie developers, as a new company, as students, or as people with not a whole lot of other external time or income to put directly towards whatever training project we have, all of that context, right? What that ultimately means is that we have to make really economic decisions. Economical decisions, excuse me. And while that may initially come off as something negative, right? We have to design a game that is intended to make money, and we have to design a game that we can actually make, and all these things that sound kind of like limitations. Really, what that comes down to is the most bang for the investment, right? So for every mechanic that we introduce, we have to make it expandable enough to justify making it, right? For everything that we build, for the amount of time that we input, right? We have to make sure that we're making things in a way that allows us to create a lot of content, or to we have to make economic decisions, that should be read as really good thing, because we are essentially cutting all the fat, right? Usually, for us to survive as a business, we have to make a game that's good, or else we just fail. So we're doing everything that we can to make that and to get as much bang for the consumer's buck as possible, because otherwise we fail artistically and as a company. So.
I like that ominous boom in there too.
Yeah, and I mean, really, in reality, a lot of people will talk about, in almost every single campaign, people will talk about why they need the money and why they've gone to Kickstarter. And I think that a lot of people, the community has gotten, can possibly get jaded towards Kickstarter, and the fact that there are so many out there, and of course, in light of like South Park episodes and things like that do kind of spoof the whole process. It is really pretty important to ours. When I talk about like our product cycle and like when we want to release, a major part of that of us being successful is, or at least successfully developing the game, is going to be a successful campaign, because then that will help us bring on more people who have already been working on the game but for free, who are graduating or recent graduates, and they need jobs. And so for us, we're lucky enough to be able to kind of juggle back and forth between our part-time work and other work and the actual game development work. But because of that, the amount of time that we can spend on the game itself isn't necessarily lessened, but it puts a bigger strain on our lives in the fact that the same amount of time will be put into work. It just means that we're not going to bed until 3 or 4 in the morning. And so whenever you add resources, whenever you add any other workers to a project, then that means that you're going to be able to increase the speed at which the game is made. And so that's largely where most of our money is going, is for some of the people who we've worked with in the past on a lot of our projects in the past, who have been helping us out on this project so far. A lot of them you can see on the Kickstarter page. They've been working with us already enough in enough of a capacity that we've made that public. And we want to be able to bring them on and actually have them be a part of the team so that we can hit that 2015 release date that we'd like to, with the scope of game that we'd like to make, and the quality of game that we'd like to make. So please, if you want to see Innerspace happen, I know people say it, but if you want to see Innerspace happen, people out there, we need your money.
Or at least support.
Right.
Yeah, I would say most Kickstarters we see aren't run by broke college students like ourselves.
Yeah.
So take pity, throw us your money. Eric, number 2, do you have anything you would like to add?
I guess as jaded as the community can get, what I like about Kickstarter is that we continuously see really awesome, inventive projects, like kind of rolling out of Kickstarter gates. Like the Battle Chef Brigade is one that kind of we all at Paul and I love.
Oh yeah.
And like just watching the gifs of that, it was like, whoa! I never knew I needed this game so badly. This is fantastic. And I think Innerspace is at least, like, I hope people see Innerspace that way. I mean, for me, Innerspace is really cool because just conceptually and actually, like, as we put it together, it becomes this really, like, a game I've never played before, but that just seems so awesome. And the fact that it's, 3 engines, like, so many different configurations of geometry and geology and all this are possible, but we so often find, like, corridor shooters or, like, top-down strategy games, or, like, there's kind of like a lexicon of perspectives that games have. And what I like about Innerspace is that it, we still have a third-person camera, but the space is totally it's not totally different. There's one other game which we like, which has, like, a spherical world, but you're running, but it doesn't have flying. So what I like about Innerspace is that it has a lot of stuff that's unique to it, and it's also really challenging to think about. But for me, it's just really fun to put it together. So I'm glad we got to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably second that one.
And, well, you mentioned the Battle Chef Brigade, and I think it's great that we can have things like Kickstarter that bring new and interesting ideas like that, where you watch that video and you say, "Oh, I want this now,"
Yeah.
really fulfill a niche that or a need that people didn't know they have or they couldn't fulfill otherwise. So it's really
Exactly.
awesome that people like your team and the Battle Chef Brigade, Trinket Studios, I believe, are able to create their dreams and also make a game that other people want too.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been fun.
Yeah, Caleb. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No, thank you.
No,